Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm exceptionally well. Thank you for asking, Rory, and we are both so grateful that you've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This is episode 209. 3 topics that we're going to be covering today, starting off with our Counselling Foundations, where we revisit the underpinnings of counselling, those strong foundations on which we build our practice. And today we're going to be looking at the therapeutic relationship. Then we move on to focus on self. That's the section where we recognize that you as the practitioner, you are the heart of your practice. And today we're looking at counseling through your own adversity. And then our final section today is practice matters. That's where we dip our toe into the pool that is practice, and we look at various elements of that. And today we're having a peek into practice. We're looking into Caroline Peacock's practice as a school counsellor. She's going to be telling us a bit about what that looks like, what an average day looks like for a school counsellor here in the United Kingdom. But kicking us off, those all-important counselling foundations, where we look today at that therapeutic relationship, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I was really interested. Earlier on this week, I was listening to a radio programme on LBC, the London Broadcasting Company or Corporation, and one of the presenters was talking about why therapy works. He'd had his own therapy, and he was interested in why therapy works. And I was so tempted to ring him and actually give him a few facts, because we kind of know why therapy works. And one of the reasons that therapy works is because we know that if there's a good therapeutic relationship and it's sustained, almost certainly that will lead to a better outcome in therapy for the clients. And it was the work of John Norcross and something called Common Factors that was done by John Norcross at Scranton University in Pennsylvania. A huge piece of research done a number of years ago, which reinforced the fact that, and we've talked about this in the podcast before, that the relationship, the quality of the relationship is a significant factor. And I think sometimes, Ken, that's forgotten, that, it's easy, isn't it, to get caught up in theory and think about the theories and applying the theories. But actually, what really, really matters is that I-thou relationship. I'm speaking about Buber, of course, that famous I-thou, not I-it. We see the person as a real person. And how we build and sustain that relationship. And I think that is where the work is, Ken.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. My heart jumped for joy when I saw this topic, Rory. And in episode 208 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, if you skip back one episode, you're going to hear Rory and I speaking about rapport building, and again focusing on how important that relationship is, the relationship between the practitioner, between the person coming in, whether it be in a counselling relationship or a helping relationship. So important. And I love how you kind of link that into why therapy works, because it's a relationship of a different kind. But when we're speaking about a therapeutic relationship, it is, of course, a contracted relationship, and it is a boundaried relationship. So yes, within that relationship, we're going to build the rapport, but we do need, of course, to visit the boundaries that hold that relationship together as part of it being a therapeutic relationship.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you've actually hit the nail on the head there, Ken, because when we have good boundaries and solid boundaries, we can be compassionate, we can be empathic, we can be everything we can be to the counsellor. And I think it was Bern Brown, the very famous American psychologist, who said that when you have boundaries, some of the most compassionate, empathic people she met have very, very strong boundaries. And I think certainly for some clients, certainly those who've had difficult childhoods, those who've had difficult relationships, having a boundaried therapist in the therapy room is so important, because it speaks, I think, to containment, containing and holding the client in a space so they can self-regulate. It's incredibly important. And I guess to some extent, part of the therapeutic relationship is what's sometimes referred to as respectful reparenting, where you're kind of echoing what a good parent should do in terms of setting boundaries, being respectful, being thoughtful, but and also, of course, being present, Ken.
Yeah, 100%. Being present, and Carl Rogers speaks about that psychological contact as being the first of those conditions recognized as necessary and sufficient for psychological process to take place for this person. And being present is part of that psychological process, that person understands they are in a relationship with another human being, that human being is integrated within that relationship for the benefit of them and that they bring in. And you can't phone that in. You can't be at a distance. You can't be contemplating what you're going to be having for dinner, because that psychological contact will fail at that point. How many times have you been in a conversation where either you yourself have felt yourself drift off, glaze over a bit, and find yourself coming back in going, what have they just said? What's just happened in those few seconds or in those few moments? Or alternatively, how many times have you felt yourself in a relationship where you're telling somebody something and you can see them switch off? You can actually see, it's almost like the light goes out of the eyes as you can see that they may even be nodding and moving their head, but you feel that there's that lack of that connection that is so important, specifically in the therapeutic relationship. And we touched on boundaries just before coming on to this. And boundaries are great because they're in place there for the client, and it kind of sets the stage. It sets out the area where the therapy takes place. And we spoke about boundaries only recently when we were speaking about one of our focus on self topics, on how boundaries protect us. And I think in order for us to be our best self when we present in the therapeutic room, the boundaries are there, yes, so that the client knows where the operating area is of the relationship, but also to keep us well, that we're not being contacted outside of the sessions, that we're not being called upon when we're not there in that special capacity, because it does take, I guess, to be fully integrated into that therapeutic relationship, it does take a level of being your best self. It doesn't mean that you're not your real self or your true self, but you are certainly putting your best self forward. And it ties into the topic we're going to be looking at next, where we're speaking about counselling through your own adversity, which we'll get to in a moment. But when you've got stuff going on, can you be your best self? And we'll look at that more in adversity. But boundaries is one way of kind of protecting that space for yourself as well, to be your best self in that therapeutic relationship.
Absolutely. And of course, Rogers wasn't wrong, in those 7 necessary and sufficient conditions published in the Journal of Consulting Psychology in 1957. Not that I have a copy on my bedside table or anything.
No.
One of the things he talked about were those 6 conditions. Yeah. Was that at some level the client accepted the congruence and unconditional positive regard of the counsellor. In other words, the client did the buy-in of what was going on and said, yes, this person's accepting me. This person is here for me. And I think that speaks hugely to the therapeutic relationship. And, you're absolutely right, Ken, when we talk about boundaries. One of the things that really impacts on boundaries is transference, my old friend. It comes to talk with me again. I'm not going to sing it.
Oh, come on.
No, I'm not going to. I'm not going to. And one of the interesting things is that one of the things that can really impact on boundaries is if the client sees you as somebody else other than the therapist. In other words, you're an echo of a relationship of the past. And part of sustaining a therapeutic relationship is to manage the transference, or to manage your own transference and the counter-transference that comes from it. And I think that even if you're a person-centered therapist, and I've had so many debates about this, that we don't, in person-centered therapy, we don't particularly talk a lot about transference, but it is a phenomenon that happens. And I think we have to acknowledge, even Roger's acknowledged it in client-centered therapy. There's a whole chapter, I think, on transference. And I think when you form that therapeutic relationship, being certain what constitutes maybe some transference from the client and be able to repair it and refocus the transference into the here and now is absolutely so important, because that's one of the things that can kind of topple over a therapeutic relationship if they see you as somebody else from their past.
Yeah, this brings up an amazingly good point, and that is that we're speaking about therapeutic relationship. The therapeutic relationship is a relationship. And when we use the word relationship, it doesn't mean that everything is happy and smiley and sunny and the birds are singing and everything is going absolutely perfectly. And you only need to look at your own life to strong relationships that you hold to recognize that relationships have ebbs and flows. They have beginnings. They have a process of forming the relationship, getting to know one another, trusting one another in the relationship. So you can have a relationship with somebody that you've just met maybe a week or so ago, and that might be very different to somebody that you've maybe known for 20 years. There would be a different depth in the relationship. Still a relationship, but they are idiosyncratic in that they would be different depending on who you're working with. The relationship element means that it is two people. It is a relating. It's not one-sided. We can't transmit out this magical relationship. It is a two-person interaction that causes this relationship. You've brought in transference, Rory, and almost got you to sing the song there. No. One day. You've brought that in that may impact on boundaries and may slightly strain or make it more difficult for the practitioner or the client to be present within the relationship in the here and now. And there are other elements, such as maybe the use of immediacy, which is an advanced counselling skill, where the counsellor might use immediacy and get it wrong. Immediacy can go wrong, and that might slightly fracture that therapeutic relationship. And you've got challenge that would come into that relationship, challenge introduced into the relationship where that could be tough for the client to have challenge presented in front of them. And of course, these skills, when we're speaking of immediacy, when we're speaking of challenge, we would look to the stages of a therapeutic relationship, and we certainly would only bring that in when the relationship was fully formed, where there was trust within it, where the relationship was robust enough to maybe handle a small bit of a fracture that could then be repaired. But we must recognize, if we're speaking about a therapeutic relationship, that it's not all plain sailing, and therapeutic relationships can break down. I've certainly had it. I don't say that with great pride, because maybe there's an element of self that thinks, how did I fail that client? But I've had a therapeutic relationship that broke down. Boy, did I take that to supervision, and it's still with me today.
I'm sure he did, Ken, and I think that speaks to the reality of what therapists do. When people think of a therapeutic relationship, I sometimes wonder if there's this kind of idealized view that it's all nice and sunshine and roses, and actually it can be pretty stormy. It can be pretty stormy, and I think one of the things that the research shows is that it's not just sustaining a therapeutic relationship. It's being able to repair ruptures.
Yeah,
it's being able to maybe say, I'm really sorry, I made a mistake here, or have I said something. And stepping out and owning up, because we're only human and sometimes we may get on the wrong track. And also I think that sometimes one of the things that can bump a therapeutic relationship is overuse of self-disclosure. I think self-disclosure needs to be really, really thought out. And I've known certainly student colleagues who have taught have given a little self-disclosure, maybe a little too much. And that has really rocked the therapeutic relationship. But yes, repairing it, going out of your way to repair it. And what I would say is that sometimes some fractures can't be repaired.
Yeah.
I think that in my experience, sometimes no matter how hard you try, once the relationship's ruptured, you really need to think about, well, is this meaningful? Is this meaningful in service of the client? Am I the right therapist for the client? Maybe that a respectful referral is put into place.
Yeah, that is certainly something to process, to think about. Something to take away from this is what you do, what your process is. If you have a therapeutic relationship that you find is not going as you would want it to be, it's not being held as you would want it to help. And it's not always from the therapist side. It can come from either side. If you're working within a therapeutic relationship, there is an onus on the client that they bring themselves, that they bring their material, that they bring a willingness to engage in what they're bringing. So there is a responsibility from both sides. And I think if there's any takeaway from this, it is that relationship is a two-way communication. You can't broadcast out a relationship. You're going to bring the elements that you can bring into the therapeutic relationship. You'll have the professional elements, you'll have the boundaries, you'll have the contract that wrap around, you'll have your way of being. You will be there with those facilitative conditions of empathy, unconditional positive regard, incongruence, being your true self. We know from the literature that will create the environment for that therapeutic relationship. But yeah, they have ebbs, they have flows. It is two-way. And I think worth talking about, worth chatting to peers about, if you're studying, worth speaking with your fellow course members about, worth journaling about. Look at your therapeutic relationships if you're in practice. Do they differ? Are they all the same? Is there an idiosyncrasy? Is there different ways that the relationship may be with different people? Is that okay? It is okay, because they are relationships, and by the very nature of relationships, my relationship with Rory is different to my relationship with my wife. They're both relationships and they're both special to me, but they do differ.
It's true, Ken. And one of the newer, more kind of progressive aspects within the therapeutic relationship is radical empathy, where you may meet someone whose values are totally opposite to yours, and you use what's sometimes referred to as radical empathy, where you try and enter that person's frame of reference and bracket your own value system to try and see the world. And I've certainly worked with colleagues who work with people on the sex offenders register, and they've worked with the perpetrators of some pretty horrific behaviours, and they managed to sustain a therapeutic relationship, but they've had to bracket their own frame of reference very, very tightly and have very, very tight supervision. But it's amazing it can be done, and that's sometimes referred to as radical empathy. But yes, I think that speak about this in your peer group, talk about it in supervision, and maybe ask your tutor about their experience. I mean, I was very, very keen, and I know we both were, Ken, when we taught together, to share with our students our experiences in a broad sense, not specific clients, but a broad sense of what the therapeutic relationship meant, and maybe being really honest about what happens when it works really well, and having to part from a client and what you're left with. Because if you've had a really strong relationship and that client isn't coming again, that can bring up a few feelings of loss. Or conversely, if you've tried to sustain a therapeutic relationship, it's fractured. Again, like Ken was saying, what does that leave you with? I think it's something that should be discussed a lot, because it's a whole lot more than the theories and everything else. It's the real, it's the meat and potatoes, as they say in my part of the world, of counselling, isn't it? The meat and potatoes.
It is indeed. And on that delicious food analogy, well, I'm vegetarian, so maybe not as delicious for me.
It's a corn,
yes,
corn and potatoes.
So that is our Counselling Foundations, looking at that therapeutic relationship. Rory has created a super duper handout, which you can get. It is free of charge. You just go to our mother website, which is counsellingtutor.com. From the top menu bar, select the podcast tab, go to episode 209. That's 209. That's today's episode. Right there on that page, you can download the Therapeutic Relationship handout. And we now move into Focus on Self. And today we're going to be looking at counselling through our own adversity, Rory.
Yes, and I have to say that it was only when we started the Facebook page, and if you're not a member of our Facebook page, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll find us. We're a closed group. Knock on the door, and our super supportive moderation team will let you in. You can join thousands of like-minded people studying counselling, people studying psychotherapy. We have students, we have qualified colleagues, we have supervisors, and we have trainers, all talking about counselling and psychotherapy. And it's a big community. And one of the things that comes up pretty regularly is people talking about their own personal adversities, usually when they're going through training, but certainly it can be in practice life, and how they're managing it. And certainly when I trained, I started in practice in 2002, November of 2002. And in the August of 2003, my mother sadly died. And that was hard on the family. And I remember going to see my supervisor and saying, should I come out of practice? Should I come out of practice? And we had this long, very honest conversation. And she said to me, you know, Rory, she said, I've counselled through pretty much a lot of adversity. And the question you have to ask yourself is, how's it impacting on you? Mm-hmm. And I never kind of considered it like that. I just thought of it as I've had a difficulty, I must stop. And it was really useful that my supervisor at the time gave me a choice. She said, have a think. Is it going to impact on your client work? Can you bracket it? And I was fortunate. I was able to, with help from the practice manager at the time, who from memory only referred clients, nothing to do with bereavements. I had a stream of clients that was anything but bereavement. And I worked through it. I reduced my hours, I seem to remember, for a few months. But it does happen. And I think that what I see in the Facebook page, and sometimes when I speak to colleagues, is that, you know, sometimes that can be a very difficult place to be. Certainly if you've got a client load and you've got adversity in your life. What do you do, Ken?
Well, I'm certainly not going to give any answers. I'll give way in a view on it. But what I think the question here is, what do you do? And this is something you need to consider personally. I mean, you've shared your story there, Rory, and you had that choice, and you were able to. And the important part here is you were able to reflect and see how that felt for you in a supportive relationship with your supervisor, being held. And it's interesting. Your gut response was, well, now I need to pull out of practice. It's almost like something's broken. I need out here, and it's going to be different for different people. The interesting thing is, I had a similar journey. In that early on in my practice, my mum passed away as well. And my reaction was the exact opposite. My reaction was, I'm fine. I can carry on with this. And going into my supervisor and exploring that and exploring how might it be if somebody presents with loss, death, cancer, end of life treatment, and what might come up for me, and could I really be there for my clients. And after considering, I stepped back from practice for a short while to kind of pull, I guess, my thoughts together and center myself. So same presentation, two different gut reactions or knee-jerk reactions with two very different outcomes. Yes. And that's why this is about you, and it's about what is going to fit for you. And counseling through our own adversity, here's one truth: it will happen. To some extent, it's going to happen, even if that's an argument with a loved one. You know, you get up in the morning and you have an argument within your home, and then an hour later you're in with a client, and there's a need to put that one side. and it can be tricky. And there is, I guess, a professional side to it, where we do bracket ourselves, where we do leave ourselves outside of the therapy room, where we leave our life behind because we're there in service of somebody else and their journey. But at the same time, we bring our congruent self into that relationship, and I was thinking this question, and I guess I've answered it for myself already, but would it be appropriate to go, when they're checking in, and if the client says, well, how are you, to go, well, I've got some challenges in my own life, but I'm very happy to say I'm going to be leaving those outside the door while we work today. Would that lead to the client wanting to rescue, wanting to ask you more? It could be a tricky place. Where do we go with congruence if we are struggling ourselves with something? Do we bring that into the relationship? Do we keep that out of the relationship? If we're keeping it out, are we keeping part of self out of the relationship? And already I can feel myself on tricky ground here, Rory, as I'm walking. I need like my supervisor. Just in this podcast, I need my supervisor as I consider this topic. And I think for that reason, it just indicates what an important topic it is.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Ken. It's not for us to proffer advice or direction on this. However, I think as a general observation, speaking to your supervisor, I know that I've had in the past supervisees who've gone through very difficult times, and I've said, shall we put that as the first point on the supervision agenda, just to check in with you, just to see how you are, because self-care is an ethical imperative. It's an ethical and moral imperative, in my view, and just to check in. And the other thing is, there's no shame in taking time out. I've known therapists, and I don't want to be too precise here, who have pushed on, and it's not been a good outcome for either them or their clients. And I'll say no more about it than that. And I think there's no dishonor in stepping out, and saying, and I understand that, if it's your livelihood, or if you're accruing hours as a student and, you're living on beans on toast and you're hoping to qualify and move on, it is tricky. However, there is no dishonor in saying, I'm just going to have to take some time out here. And certainly I've worked with students and, qualified colleagues where we've come to agreement that maybe just a little time out, just a little time to get that person together and to do a bit of healing is going to be very useful for them and definitely in service of their client.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Rory. It's the adage. I mean, this is focus on self. This section is focus on self, and it's the adage of we need to be okay to be there for someone else. And there's the illustration of being in an aeroplane, and the aeroplane experiences a sudden loss in cabin pressure. The protocol is you put your own mask on first before you start helping others, so that you're okay, so that you can make it through. Because if you don't put your own mask on first, then chances are you're going to black out in trying to help other people. You're not going to help yourself, and you're certainly not going to be able to help them. So we need to be okay. We need to focus on self. And I guess it's that balance of, am I okay? I'm thinking it in terms of injury. If you fall over and you injure yourself and you hurt your knee, the knee may be hurting and it may be sore, and you may still be able to go on and get through what you need to do with a bit of a sore knee. But if you dislocate it and every single movement is absolute agony, then going on and trying to do any tasks is just not in service of yourself or your body. And the same is true when we're facing adversity. We need to look at how it is affecting us, and not necessarily what the presentation is, because as we kind of discussed in our paralleled stories there, Rory, the presentation was the same thing, but the outcome and how we deal with things are very different. You may have someone who loses a pet and is absolutely broken, distraught, cannot carry on. You can have someone else who loses a pet and go, well, that was a pet, and I can go on and face that. So it's going to be about you and how you weigh that up and how you kind of measure what that impact is. And I think if there's any takeaway that I learned from my own journey, it is to take it to supervision as soon as you can, no matter what that adversity is, because we can be blindsided by our own adversities. We can be going through a denial phase where, this is not really affecting me, where it might be, and we might not be able to see it. So get the considered view of another who is there in service of your practice, your clients.
Couldn't agree more, Ken. And I also think that putting into practice, looking after self is really important. I think one of the fundamental principles of therapy, and I draw from the psychoanalytic tradition, is I'm okay, you're okay. That at least one person in the room is okay. And that's usually the therapist, reasonably okay, and can help the other person come to a place of stability and introspection. And I think if you've got someone who's unwell or struggling as a therapist, that really isn't going to happen with the client. You can't carry someone up a mountain very effectively if both your legs are broken, is what I would say. So have a think about it. If this is happening to you, speak with your supervisor. If you're a student, speak with your peers and your tutor, and try and process it. I suspect that this part of the podcast will touch a nerve for quite a few of the people who are listening, Ken.
Yeah, very much so, and that's why we have it. That is that focus on self. And again, Rory said it, I've said it, and we'll repeat this so many times. We're not here saying what you should do in these situations. No. We're not the experts preaching. We're just two colleagues having a chat about certain topics and having a bit of a discussion. And our main aim is to fire that up in yourself, that you'll think about it, that you'll process it, that you'll have the discussion with your peers, with your supervisor, because the more we consider and the more we have these discussions, I guess the more we inform ourselves, and it's all in service of the clients that we will see. And of course, looking after ourselves, we are the heart of our practice, and that was our focus on self. Our next section today, Practice Matters, where we look at an element of practice, and I'm excited for today's. I really am, because Rory, you met up with Caroline Peacock, who spoke about what it's like to be a school counsellor. Now, I worked for some time in a college, which is kind of, I guess, a slightly older age group. But I've always had my eye on the school counselling. I know that it is very much of this moment. I know that there are certain parts of the United Kingdom where a school counsellor is commonplace. I know there are other parts of the United Kingdom where they are very seriously considering bringing more school counsellors in. I think this is probably a big growth area in counselling and psychotherapy, and will be maybe of interest to many.
Yes, absolutely, and you're absolutely right, Ken. It's a very different kind of way of working than maybe working with adults. And we spoke to Caroline Peacock, and this is what she had to say.
Practice matters.
I'm joined by Caroline Peacock from her car in France, such is the state of our wonderful technology, who's going to talk us through being a school counsellor. So first of all, Caroline, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Rory. Appreciate it.
So how long have you been a school counsellor?
I'm just coming into my third year now. 3
years as school counsellor. So
yeah, but I've worked in schools prior to that for 10 years.
Okay, so first of all, Caroline, how does working with children differ from working with adults?
Working with children, I'm going to generalize here, but I think in general, they are, because obviously it depends on the trauma or what they've experienced, but generally they seem to be more trusting because they go on the energies that of the actual counsellor, as opposed to they don't have as much guard up and all the what's happened beforehand. So they do generally, I find that they go with the energies as in the room and what's actually there.
Yeah, so they're more trusting, more maybe open to expect.
Yeah. In general, Yeah, if you, I'd say that the younger the child, the more trusting they seem to be. Yes.
Sure, and there's a lot of discussion around, ages of children and how do we gauge competency, and of course, Gillick competency is something that is usually applied when working with children. I think over the age of 13, if my memory serves me correctly. So, how do you apply Gillick competency, or do you use Gillick competency in terms of making sure that the people you're working with, the young people you're working with, understand what's going to happen and what might happen through the arc of therapy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I do work with the children and young people in the school, we've got, as opposed when I'm talking about Gillick competency, I tend not to work. I prefer to have children and their families on board, because obviously therapy counselling works better when there's all the holistic and they have the wraparound care. But when deciding Gillick competency, you have to know your Gillick competency and the actual rules and the law itself, because you may come across it within a session. And you may have two 14-year-olds presenting to you, and both of them, one of them you may perceive, because it doesn't go along biological age, but one of them is you perceive as being, and you've assessed as being Gillick competent, but you have another 14-year-old who is presenting at the age of 10. So I may say, and when I say, I don't mean biologically 10 years of age, I mean psychologically, and their makeup is at 10 years of age. And I may perceive, and I may say to them, I think it's important that we have other people involved in that. So It does. It's not an age thing, as in biological age. It's definitely how they present.
Yes, and I think I'm right in thinking in Gillick competency there is an age range that you apply it to. So you couldn't apply Gillick competency to a 5-year-old, could you?
Oh gosh, no. I wouldn't generally do it to anybody under the age of 14 myself.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm a former school counsellor. One of the things that I learned, and I wonder if it's the same in your experiences. What part do traditional counselling modalities work with children, and what doesn't?
Yeah. I think it does obviously depend on the individual, and it does depend on the age of the individual as well, because I'm working with 4 to 17-year-olds, and some like 4-year-olds will just walk in the room and they're just there. They play therapy. It's client-centered. It's always the case that it's client-centered for me. I think it has to be client-centered when it comes to children and young people. And it's important for me, as I practice client-centered. And what the modalities that work for them is, there are so many modalities that you need to be able to integrate them. So you need to be clued up on or trained, should I say, in various modalities, because you do not know what's going to present in the room. It may be something that you want to apply CBT, the client wants to use CBT approach, and how you have that conversation with them when you're planning, say, for example, an older child, or it may be it's play therapy, where it's completely they don't realize that it's they're actually healing themselves from within. So it does depend on the child completely, but it's important to have a lot. When I say a lot, various different modalities and various different tools within your head.
Yeah, so more of an integrative approach may be useful, which kind of brings me on to my next question. What do you have in your space to help children communicate? And do you need a lot in the space? You need
yourself. And you need yourself to be present within that space. And that's the most important thing that you need in the space. That's paramount. You can have nothing in the space, because sometimes it's that you have that. What's really important about that, I'd say a pen and paper. is what you can have sometimes. I mean, when I've been peripatetic working in a school, say for example something's happened and my car and I've only had a pen and paper, and you can communicate with that therapeutic relationship and still continue that therapeutic relationship with the child or young person, and it may only be a pen and paper that you have, and you don't need to use your voice. But what was I going to say is the fact is it's the space itself that's so important as well, because you've got to remember when you're working in schools that you've got to be aware of the actual space itself. Is this space also a place that has been used? Is it safe environment? Are they used to being reprimanded within this environment? So it's the space itself has got to be it's got to be a safe environment for them as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, because you're working really in the school's estate, aren't you? Working within the school confines. So that brings me to our next question: what challenges does working in a school present?
It's when you can actually be seen, because obviously when I work 5 days in a school, and when I'm walking around, say for example, I could potentially be working with two siblings, and it's the fact that they've only got one counsellor that they see, and they may have the question of, oh gosh, are they saying something about me? Are they saying something about to my sister or to my brother, or what's being said there? And it's something you've got to address those things when they actually, even before they've actually come into the room, because you may sense that, you may be aware of that, but they may not have brought it into the room. And I think it's something that does need addressing, and I do address it straight away. Other things that you need to be aware of, my different roles. I do change. For example, I wear glasses, and I change my glasses. I change my I take my lanyard off. I take my jacket off because I wear a suit normally, and so my appearance changes completely. As much as I can anyhow, and also making sure that the boundaries are there, so they know that I changed my name. Outside the room I'm known as Mrs. Peacock. Inside they can call me Caroline, but sometimes they don't feel comfortable doing that, and they might still call me Miss, but it's just getting that. I just said, look, you can still call me Mrs. Peacock, just from so Caroline. It's completely up to you, whichever feels comfortable for you. And that's obviously comes with a therapeutic relationship and building that trust and that safe space for them to express themselves.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, I would imagine that within that there would be an issue around confidentiality, because part of because you're part of a multidisciplinary team.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing I do is set down those boundaries and the confidentiality, and I have for the older children and young people, or those I feel that I have either a pictorial for the younger ones to say this is what the contract is, and obviously I have a written document for the those who are older, and I give them the opportunity, do they want to take it with them, the document for the confidentiality and the contract, or do they want to keep it in the room? Because sometimes they may want to keep it in the room, because everything, then they know that it's a safe environment, it's kept there for them, and then they can choose to keep it or not.
Yes, it is interesting, and that kind of leads me on to my next question was, do you get involved with parents? Sometimes you have to speak with parents, and if so, how do you balance confidentiality out there?
Yeah, it is encouraged. As I mentioned earlier, the fact is, I would encourage it. It obviously does depend from case to case, but on the whole, I would suggest that parents or carers are involved, and especially you have to obviously be very, very sensitive. For example, if it's going from, especially when it's carers going from foster caring to adoption. Because you're going to have various different people that are know about things, but the paramount thing is you communicate with a child or young person. What do they want? Do they want their parent or carer to know? And if they're not GILIC competent and they don't want their parents to know, my boundary is, I'm really sorry that you don't feel that you can your parents to know this, but I can't actually work with this because it won't be safe for me to be working with you in this instance. or another adult does need to know, for example, a teacher or somebody else like that. But it works best with the parent, because ultimately I'm with the child for 45, 50 minutes. And I am that advocate for that child for 45, 50 minutes in a whole week. And then it's only for 38 weeks of the year. Yes. And it's just like they need that wraparound care. It's communicating with the parents as much, and the carers as much as possible. And obviously the parents may feel threatened. The fact is, how come she knows, or the therapist or the counsellor knows this information, and they're not telling me anything about it? Why is it? Why does it have to stay confidential? And I can totally understand that from experience as a parent with my child going into therapy. But also the fact is that I can understand from their point of view why they feel this way, but speaking to the child or the client first, so they know, and the transparency there, that they know what is being shared and they are comfortable with what I am sharing.
Yes, it is as you're kind of outlining what it is to be a school counsellor. You're outlining quite a few different dynamics that need to be taken into consideration, quite different from working in maybe general practice when you're working with adults. I've got one final question, and it's one that's always fascinated me, and I'd be interested on your take. Do you think it's important to understand your own attachment style when working with children?
I think not only is it imperative, I'm using the word imperative, your own attachment style, but you understand all attachment styles. That is where, I can remember when I did my training to start with, right at the beginning of the certificate. One of the first things we did at the certificate, because I trained initially as a play therapist, was we did attachment styles. And we had to find out what our own attachment styles was, and we had to address it creatively, given, but we had to address it. And I think that's really important, because if you have a child that comes in, or a client that comes in, young person comes in with an ambivalent attachment, and then you know what you're going to get, and you yourself have a ambivalent attachment, you need to be presenting that secure base for them. And you need to have that therapy beforehand, so you have actually addressed your own attachment style. I would actually argue that you actually need to address it, so you can actually tune into yourself and know that you are in a secure attachment, and offering that secure attachment to that child for that 45, 50 minutes to keep yourself safe, but also to keep them safe.
Well, Caroline, I think it's the interesting answer to that question, and it absolutely is the same conclusion I came to myself and how I was trained. So, Caroline Peacock, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure, Rory. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you to Caroline Peacock. Thank you to you, Rory, for hosting that podcast interview. And this has been episode 209 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, it has. And we started off in Counselling Foundations speaking about the therapeutic relationship. What are the ingredients that go into making a therapeutic relationship? We moved on to focus on self, where we talked about counselling through personal adversity, and maybe some of the considerations and the self-reflection needed if that happens to you. And then finally, we ended with Practice Matters, interview with Caroline Peacock, talking about her practice as a school counsellor. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counsellor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counsellor CPD Library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.